Good to see you back this evening. Good to be together and worship the Lord in this evening time before we start our week. And Sunday's the first day of the week, but it's also the beginning and the day that we focus our attention on Christ. And we have other things we know that we'll have to do this week, but how good and pleasant when we can be together and worship and think about the things that really count eternally before we enter into our week. We all of our lives, and it's not just us, all kind of religious people, have been big fans of Psalm 23. Psalm 23 represents one of those texts of the Bible that's very impressive and very important in telling us about our relationship with the Lord. As you look at this evening, you know the psalm. I imagine you could quote it as I put it up here. But he begins by saying, "The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want." That image tells us a lot about what can be true between you and the Lord. David brags in this psalm about the relationship he has in Jesus Christ. David, in this psalm, tells us a little bit about what it was like to be a sheep under a shepherd in that day and time. Some shepherds of that day, as with any time and anybody that would be over anything, some shepherds were kind and gentle and had the welfare of their flock at the heart. Some shepherds were cruel and they cared nothing about the sheep. Jesus talks about the difference between a good shepherd and a hireling. The good shepherd, of course, is the shepherd that you want to be under, and he's worth bragging about. You don't want to miss the opening line because he's saying, "The Lord is my shepherd." And the emphasis, I believe, is on the "my." He is the shepherd that belongs to me. I want to tell you something. Not everybody has that promise. Anybody can have it, but not everybody does have it. There are a lot of people who may speak of the psalm and speak of the shepherd, but I want you to know this evening it makes all the difference in the world whether you can say, "The Lord is my shepherd." He is a shepherd, but is he your shepherd? And that really counts when we stop and think about him and his sheep. He is the good shepherd because he knows his sheep. He knows the different characteristics that his sheep have. He knows about the times they will go through, whether it be the cold days, cold nights, or the hot days. He knows the kind of land they have to travel to get the right kind of food. He knows the waters that they need to drink from. He knows if any one of those sheep have gotten lost or separated from his flock. He knows about his sheep, and he knows each one individually, that every sheep matters. Isaiah talked about the Lord as the good shepherd, and he said in chapter 40, verse 11, "Like a shepherd, he will tend his flock. In his arms, he will gather the lambs, and he'll carry them in his bosom, and he will gently lead the nursing ewes." You understand, we aren't really talking about sheep. We're talking about God and his people. What God's willing to do. Now, you can't imagine a more tender thought than the idea that God would gather us up and carry us like a shepherd would carry the little ewe lambs. Now, it's not a surprise, and I'm going to be real frank with you. When the Bible makes a comparison between you and sheep and me and sheep, it's not a compliment. The sheep that he's talking about have unique characteristics. It is true. You know, you look out, and we don't have many sheep in this part of the country. That's had quite a few when we lived out at Kerrville because that's hilly country, and they flourish better in a dry climate, kind of like that. But if you look at them, they look gentle, but there are some things about sheep. They're kind of stubborn, and they kind of want to get to their own way. They go to their own pasture, and they go to their own water, and quite frankly, that's why they need a shepherd. They make bad choices, and they need the leadership and discipline of a shepherd. And in this psalm, you notice it mentions, and we'll get to the full statement in a minute, but it says, He leads me. He makes me. That's the strength of the shepherd and his leadership. You know, little old sheep out here, they don't have any defense. If you look at their body frame and how they're built, they cannot run fast. If a predator comes after them, they just nearly are, it's going to end bad. If dogs attack or wolves attack or whatever it may be, those things have been known to enter a flock and kill 100 sheep in a single night. They just don't have the natural defenses. That, again, is part of the reason that they need a shepherd. They always need help, you might say. They need a shepherd nearby. When he says, the Lord is my shepherd, he follows it by saying, I shall not want. And that's an important statement to stop and think about, that when you have the Lord as your shepherd, and you might think of God as your shepherd and Jesus Christ as your shepherd in that sense, that you can say, I shall not want, because in essence he's saying, I have what I really need. I have what really is important. You don't have everything you want in life, and you don't have everything maybe even that you kind of need physically in life, but you have everything that counts in life. Psalm 84 verse 11 makes this statement. Remember, these kind of things are promises and statements of fact in Scripture. It says, no good does the Lord withhold from those who walk uprightly. If you'll be one of the Lord's sheep, He will not withhold any good thing from you. Now, He determines what's good, and He determines what you need. But that's one of those great promises. It says in the New Testament, Paul said, my God shall supply all your needs according to His riches in glory in Christ Jesus. And anything that we truly need spiritually can be ours by God's good providence and by God's good design. He will supply all the needs that we really have, and that has to do with the supply that comes from the riches of the glory in Jesus Christ. So the Lord is my shepherd. Now, everything else we're going to say about the shepherd is based on this idea, and that is the Lord is my shepherd. When you start there, then the next few lines that come forth out of this psalm really tell you facts and truths about the shepherd. One of the things He will do for you is it says He will make me lie down in green pastures. Sheep are fidgety and they're excitable. And one of the things, if they're hungry, they're not going to stay still. They're going to be out looking for their own food if there's no shepherd to guide them. I sometimes really wonder how, until there were men to come along and be shepherds, I wonder how the sheep got along that were wild and out there on their own. I bet they didn't last very long, because they're so helpless and they're so in need. The shepherd has to come along and make the sheep do something. He makes them to lie down in green pastures. You understand that that's the process by which they'll get the right nourishment, the right help. Let me read you something that I found very interesting. Now, this is from the book of Ezekiel. One of the things in Ezekiel, he kind of gets into this business. He says that he did not trust, that is God, did not trust the people that were supposed to be the shepherds of the flock back in that day and time. He said they weren't taking care of the people and they were misleading the people. Well, here's what he says in chapter 34. He talks about, he says, now he speaks of the fact that as the Lord, I'm going to take care of the shepherding process because I can't trust the men that should have been the shepherds of Israel. He said, I will bring them out from the peoples, and I'll gather them from the countries, and I'll bring them to their own land, and I will feed them on the mountains of Israel by the streams and in all the inhabited places of the land. There's something interesting in Ezekiel, the way he says that. He talks about it as if, in other words, I've got sheep all over this world. And he says, I'm going to go gather them all up into one group. And I'm going to gather them from all the countries, and I'll bring them to their own land. And I'm going to bring them and I'm going to feed them up on the mountains of Israel by the streams and in these inhabited places of the land. I'll feed them in a good pasture, and their grazing ground will be on the mountain heights of Israel. Kind of keep that phrase in mind because I'm coming back to it later. They will lie down on good grazing ground, and they'll feed in rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I will feed my flock, and I will lead them to rest, declares the Lord. So you kind of get the gist behind the psalm and the same thoughts that God is expressing, that I'm going to take care of my people, and I'm going to be sure that they're fed on the right kind of diet, and I'm going to give them the very best that direction. And I want to tell you something tonight, that when we talk about and say, the Lord is my shepherd, we need to understand that God has given us the riches of the best pasture that we can get us to graze on. That's the best thing He could give us. Those are the truths that will help us to be nourished and strong and healthy spiritually. God can do all of this for you and me, and that's what He wants to accomplish for us. Those are the things that He can do in our lives, but we've got to let Him be the shepherd. He wants to take us to the greenest pasture around and the best place that He could feed us on. Now let's look at another thought that goes hand in hand. It says He leads me beside still waters. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside these still waters. He takes me to places where I can get the thirst quenched. Now, sheep will lie down when they can have a green pasture to graze in and good water to drink. But if they don't have those things, they're just on the move constantly. They're searching for something else. You get a sheep without water, just like any other animal. Gets dehydrated, gets in a bad way. Here's something about sheep, folks, and that's, you can look at me and know I'm just an expert at that kind of thing. Sheep seek out anything that looks drinkable. And that means if you have an old pothole that water collected in and it's gotten stagnant and it's muddy and, you know, it's just really trashed out, let's say, well, the sheep doesn't mind going and drinking in that. I mean, we all know of our pets and animals that do the same thing. Well, they think nothing of that. It takes a good shepherd to get them to the right source of water. And the bad news is there's a whole lot of people today that we're not following the shepherd. And you know what? We're drinking from dirty waters. We're going to sources. People are going to pornography, and they're going to filth, and they're going to worldliness, and they're getting their drink there. Or they're going to the font of human wisdom instead of divine wisdom, and they're getting their drink there. Jeremiah said, you know, he said, God through Jeremiah spoke, and he said it's a terrible thing about my people. He said, they have fresh water coming from me, but he said they go get water out of an old cistern that the water's turned green and stagnant and full of bugs and everything else. He said, here you could have fresh, delicious water coming from the stream, but they seek that old polluted water. And that's kind of what he's talking about sheep here. And he's saying that God has to take them and lead them by still waters, places where it's not polluted, where they won't get the parasites and germs that help destroy their health. We need that kind of shepherd. You know, in those two statements, He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Do you think any sheep ever had, back there in Israel, do you think any of them ever had to have a map to know how to follow the shepherd? Do you think any of them that the shepherd had to come out and say, okay, you know, now here's where we're going, and that's where I'm going to be taking you tomorrow? Well, obviously not. But what did you have to be to benefit from that shepherd? You had to go where he led you. You had to wind up wherever he was. You had to stay close to him. And that's the whole idea behind it. He's going to take you to the places you need to be. And the sheep, they weren't going to be able to wake up every morning and say, well, I know where we're going to graze today. That wasn't important. What was important was to go where the shepherd went, and then you'd be fine. That's what we've got to do. We don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, but we know that if we stay with the shepherd, things will be all right. He is going to take care of us. One of the things that it says about him is, he restores my soul. And the word restore there conveys the idea of bringing back to the place of a former position. God putting us back where we need to be. Now, you think over in Psalm 119, one of the things David said there, he said, before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep thy word. You've got to stop and think about what he's saying. It took some affliction from God to come on my life to get me back to where I need to be. A few verses later, he said, it was good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes. Sometimes we have to go through difficult times from God's hand in order to be back where we need to be. So the process of restoring our souls isn't always an easy one. I'm sure there were a lot of situations. They say that sheep could just get themselves in all kind of messes. I'm sure there were a lot of situations that sheep could get into. One of the things I read in a book one time about sheep, one of the things that they did was that a sheep would kind of get back and it'd get to wallowing. You know, we think about a pig or something, or even a dog doing that. Get on their back and start wallowing around, and then they'd make a depression. And said the way sheep kind of are, sometimes if you got a low spot, and he's just wallowing back and forth, maybe he's kind of scratching his back, and then all of a sudden the sheep realized something. He couldn't get back over. Couldn't get his feet back on the ground. He's turned upside down and in such a spot that he couldn't get out of that spot. Well, one of the problems that happened, and that evidently did happen quite a bit, one of the problems that would happen was the sheep's limbs are sticking up straight in the air and the blood flow is going away from it, so you know, it's gradually losing feeling and all of that. If it stays that way a long time, it's, you know, predators could get it or whatever. So the good shepherd would come and he'd find that sheep. And this may not be exactly what David meant, but he'd have to get that sheep and get it back on its feet again, turn it back over, and restore it back to where it was. And we understand that the Lord's going to have to take our lives through His Word and change them around, and it may not be a pleasant process, but it's going to take a little bit of time. But it's going to have to happen in order for us to get back to where we need to be. David talks about this, and I don't know when he wrote Psalm 23. I'm not sure what time of his life he wrote that. I don't think anything's ever said that makes it clear. Because David had been a shepherd, and he knew about these things. But when he says about the Lord as his shepherd, it says he restores my soul. Do you remember when David committed the sin with Bathsheba? And he got into so much trouble. Now, he's the king. They're not going to take him and go out and execute him for doing what he did, even though it deserved it. He wasn't going to be punished that way, but God sent Nathan the prophet. He confronted David. He challenged him about the kind of conduct he had been carrying on and the things he had done, not only in regard to Bathsheba, but her husband Uriah the Hittite, and how he'd set him up to be murdered. There were some terrible things that had gone on. In Psalm 51, David wrote, and you know what he said to the Lord? He said, restore, this was his psalm of repentance. He said, restore unto me the joy of my salvation. David's asking God, please set me back on my feet again. Get me back to where I was. Get me back to where I had been. Now, God let David go through some grave difficulties after that. They lost that child that was born to that union. David's sons turned against him. There's all kind of family trouble. Absalom literally ran him out of town and tried to take the throne. He didn't succeed because that wasn't God's will. David had very little peace the rest of his life. And that's sad. The days of David were pretty unhappy after that. But you know what? David could die saying, I have the Lord. There's a lot of things about that that aren't pleasant. And sometimes I talk to people about David, and we're talking about sin in people's lives, and they just frankly get in my face and say, I just don't understand how he could get away with all of that. Well, he didn't really get away with much of anything. But I want to tell you, here's the facts. Uriah died and wasn't coming back, and it was David's fault. Bathsheba could never reclaim her virginity, her innocence from that marriage. A lot of things would never be able to be changed about this situation. But David could be restored back to the Lord. David was never going to have a good relationship with his family again. That breaks my heart to stop and think about. But David could have a relationship with the Lord. He could be back in fellowship with God. And that's what he was pleading for. David didn't really ask. I don't know of a time he ever asked God, take away all these things. He did plead for the life of the child when God said the child would die. But through all of his other troubles, he didn't say, will God get me out of this? It's unfair. He understood some of that had come upon him because of what he'd done. But he still needed to be restored. That's something we all need to think about. It's not pleasant. And yet, a restoration of our fellowship with God is so very important. Another part of the psalm says, He leads me. He leads me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Now, we have to be led, and we need a shepherd, because here's the fact about us as sheep. It says in Isaiah 53, at verse 6, all we like sheep, all of us like sheep, have gone astray. This is quoted in the New Testament too. We have turned everyone to his own way. As sheep, we tend to go our own direction, want to do the way we want it to be done. But we all need a shepherd. And so what we read about is that Jesus brought out his own, and he goes before them, and the sheep follow him. Now, as our good shepherd, he stepped in, and he saw what we needed. And he saw that we would only do ourselves harm if we went our own way. So he turned us back from the route that we were on and turned us to something better, something more wonderful, something happier. And all of the broken hearts and all the broken homes and all of the lives that have been messed up by sin just remind us how high the cost is when we decide to go our own way. The fact is that we're very fortunate. I thought Zach's sermon was good this morning in pointing this out, in that he showed you, here's what we were, and here's what we are now, and here's what we can be as we press on towards the high call of God. And we need to realize that Jesus is trying to get us out of the condition that we were in when we all went our own way. He had to take the burden upon himself and take our sins upon himself, but by doing that, he made a way to lead us out of a life that was very destructive and did us no good. There's something interesting about the way Jesus never drives the sheep. Jesus leads the sheep. He leads us in paths that will take us to a righteous path rather than a sinful path. He leads us in that way, and he takes care of us by showing us the ways that we need to live, how we need to act, who our allegiance needs to belong to. He does this not because we're worthy, but because of who he is. He does it, he says, for his own name's sake. If you were back in that day and time a conscientious shepherd, and you were working hard, and you wanted his sheep to be well taken care of, and you wanted somebody to come by and not see a bunch of half-starved, parasite-ridden sheep that were open prey for the wolves, when you wanted people to look at your sheep and say, man, that's a good flock of sheep over there, you did it because your name was associated with it all. Jesus leads us to righteous paths rather than sinful paths Because he doesn't want to be the shepherd over a bunch of worthless sheep that are so deteriorated it's sad. He wants to be the shepherd over those sheep walking paths of righteousness. That's what he's striving to get out of us. That's where he wants us to go. That's where he wants to lead us to. And that's what we're going to have to accept if we're going to follow along. It's an interesting story I read about. A bunch of people had gone over as tourists to Palestine to look at, all the customs and ways of the people over there. Well, one of the things that the driver was telling him, said, now you're going to see all the ways that people take care of things. And one of the things he wanted to show them was an example of a shepherd leading his flock. Well, they were going along, and they found this guy, but he wasn't leading the flock. He was going behind them and cracking a little whip-like thing and driving the sheep along. And he was pretty perplexed about that because he had not seen many people do that. He kept saying, well, most of the time over here, the shepherds lead the sheep. They walk ahead of them, and the sheep naturally follow them because they know that's my shepherd over there. And he said, that's the way it usually is, but he said, I can't quite figure out why that guy over there is driving them along. And so he pulled his Jeep and vehicle on over near that man, and he said, I want to ask you a question. He said, I thought most of you shepherds led the flock. And he said, no. He said, I'm driving the flock. And he said, but I'm not a shepherd, I'm a butcher. I'm taking them somewhere else. They aren't going to green pastures, they're going to be butchered. Now, you stop and think about it. The devil drives us. We don't think about it sometime, but he's constantly pushing. He's constantly trying to infiltrate our lives and push us a certain direction. When he says in Romans 12, don't be conformed to this world. The word conform there means to push you like you're pushing clay into a mold. That's what the devil's trying to do. He pushes and pushes and pushes his way upon you. It's like a bunch of, you can tell how he works because his servants work that way. And you get around sometimes people that are wicked or whatever, and they're trying to push you into becoming that. They want you to conform to their ways. Go back and read the Gospels. Do you ever remember Jesus getting before his disciples and pushing and pushing and pushing? He led. Yeah, he taught sometimes, but he showed them the way. And guess what? He never got behind and said, hey, get on up there and get ahead. He led and showed them where they needed to go. You remember about prayer? They came to him and said, teach us to pray, Lord, because they saw how well he prayed. They were being led, not pushed. They saw it. And I'm not trying to treat the push business as if we shouldn't be pushed. I guess we really should be. But the Lord just doesn't deal with us that way. He's gentle, and he leads. Now, there'll come a day when he'll judge, and that's the simple truth about it. And he'll judge very severely when he separates the sheep from the goats. We also understand the place that he holds in our lives and how he leads us. The psalm goes on and it says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. A couple of things I didn't know about what he's saying there. I do know that over in Israel there are, man, that's a land where nothing is straight. And when you talk about hills over there, you're just going up and down, and it's just a maze of hilly country, especially around Jerusalem and Judea and those areas. That's true hill country. And a lot of that, when you're walking along, you're going down and you get in valleys. And sometimes there's these big old cliffs on either side of you. And when you're walking down, it gets real dark all of a sudden because the valleys are so deep and the cliffs are so high that as that picture represents, you're down in the shadowlands there. Now, he says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And I found something real interesting, it is to me. Looking at that Hebrew word, and I found out there is no shadow of death, but that's all one word in the Hebrew, but it is composed of two words, and it meant death shadow. Death shadow. Yea, though I walk through the valley in the death shadow, I will fear no evil. So he's talking about going through something that's extremely frightening, something that really would get your attention for sure, because this death shadow, I would think, is the moments in our lives when we're confronted by overwhelming situations that are frightening and scare us. Maybe it is the hour when the doctor tells you that you have a very, very serious disease such as cancer, and that he hopes he can help you, but he doesn't really know whether you'll recover. Well, you're in that death shadow right then. Maybe it's when he comes out and tells you about a loved one, that they are very seriously ill. Many of us have sat by the bedsides of one of our friends or relatives that was dying. And we're, a lot of times in those moments, in the valley of the shadow of death. It could be about ourselves, in other words, that we're the one that's facing death. I think it could be any number of things, and I think it could go beyond just the question of death and just be those worst of moments of life when life confounds us and overwhelms us, and it just looks dismal. He says you're out there walking, but I'm with you. Lo, I'm with you. Yea, though I'd walk through the valley of the shadow of death, Lord, you're right there with me the whole time. Jesus walked through the valleys himself. He knew what it was all about. He knew what it was like to be in that. He went through those days, and he found them very difficult. But he says, I'd be with you through all of those days. You know what? It's interesting to me. I think you're starting to see why through the years, the soldier was going to war, sometimes they wanted to read this song. When ministers are called upon to do funerals, family members would put it on the back of the obituary. They'd ask the preacher, said, would you please read that song? Or whether asked to or not, sometimes the preacher would just read it. Because we all go to the valley of the shadow of death, and we'd like to think the Lord is with us. Now, I'm not trying to minimize the promise, but keep in mind, you got to start the way the psalm starts to say this. The Lord is my shepherd. Because if you didn't start there, don't expect his help in the valley of the shadow of death. You got to wake up and make him your shepherd if that's what you want. And that means making your life accountable to his leadership. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. It's believed that the rod was kind of like a symbol of authority. It was kind of a club-like object that was used a lot of times to fight off the wild beasts. It kind of evoked fear to the wild animal, but I don't know if the sheep would have really thought much about it, but a thinking man realized that the Lord's club over there, his rod, that can take care of me, in other words. And the staff can comfort me. Now, the staff probably did look something like that one might look. It is said to have been a little hook type-shaped rod. And here's a couple of uses for it that I read about. One is, let's say you're a sheep, and in the effort to get another bite of something, you're just maneuvering ever and ever closer to the cliff. And here's a big drop-off, but you're not paying attention. And you're just about to go over, it's like I'm nearly about to go over there, and it reaches out, and the shepherd's hook grabs you gently, but grabs you by the neck and pulls you back. Or maybe you're over here and you're like one of the sheep I mentioned earlier, and here's water, and you just think, man, that'll be fine. And yet it's a filthy, polluted hole of water over there, and you're just about to drink from it, and the shepherd jerks you back and says, no, you don't. You're not drinking there. Now you might say, well, I don't want to be jerked around by the neck. But he's saying that the rod and the staff of the shepherd are of great comfort to us when you stop and think about it, because he's not going to let me. If I'll listen to him, if I'll let him help me, he's not going to let me drink out of a polluted hole. He's not going to let me go over a cliff if I'll just let his leadership rule in my life, if I'll just be a follower of the Good Shepherd. Now it says he prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. That's one of the hardest ones to explain when you're talking about sheep, because who on earth thinks of a shepherd setting up a table as if, in other words, we're going to feed the sheep off the table? Now here's a thought, you might take it into consideration. I don't know absolutely if that's what David meant or not. But I do know that the word table represents an idea, and that is, sometimes you may have heard it called tableland, and that actually is a mountain plateau. Now, a while ago we were reading, I believe that was Psalm 34, if I remember correctly, or Ezekiel 34, that we were reading from, and it kept emphasizing, I'm going to take you up and feed you on the hills of Judea. I'm going to take you up over here in Jerusalem and Israel. I'm going to feed my flock over here. That tableland was mountain plateau, and that was some of the richest pasture land you could have, and that is sometimes called the table or the tableland. And it could be that that's the idea behind it, that the Good Shepherd has gone before and made sure, okay, here's where they can get the best feed. Here's where they can pasture in the best places. So he said, thou preparest a table before me. And he said, you do so in the presence of my enemies. Now, it may be that David thinking a little more about himself there, but at the same time, as he stands here, I'm being treated royally while the others out there look on. The Lord is taking good care of me. He's watching out for me. One of the things it says about him, he said, he anoints my head with oil. Now that might not sound like a really great thing to have poured over your head, but I think if I understood it correctly, that was kind of the way that you dealt with the parasites and the flies and the things that came around and bothered the sheep. Pests could just agitate the sheep all the time. The anointment of oil and fragrant type things could rid them of those pests, keep them off the sheep. And because of that, it kind of is his way of quieting us. You anoint my head with oil, and then he follows that by saying the idea that my cup runs over. I don't know if you've appreciated or care about a lot of the things we've talked about in the lesson tonight. You may think, well, I'm not a sheep, even though he kind of says we are. But what I want you to think about is the relationship we have with the shepherd. If we really appreciate it and enjoy it and respect it, every one of us who grasp it can walk away and say, my cup is overflowing. I've got more than anybody could ever have imagined. Paul said it this way, to him who's able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think according to the power that works in us. He can do exceedingly abundantly above even what we can comprehend. That's how much he can do for us. And then this psalm, he says, the Lord is the portion of my inheritance, and my cup, you support my life. You know, when you stop and think about it, he says, my cup runneth over, and then here he says, the Lord is my cup. When you got God as your cup, he's going to be running over. When you got the Good Shepherd as your shepherd, you're going to be running over. You're going to have things because you've got a shepherd that really cares about you. You know, the world whispers its ways, and like I was portraying Satan a while ago, yeah, Satan says, come on, man, go my direction, I'll show you better things. He's driving us the whole time. But remember my illustration, that's the butcher. That's the butcher, and that's where he's taking you. The Lord's tried to lead you to something better. And the Lord is our portion, and the Lord is what we get. And he says, my cup is overflowing. And then he finally wraps up this psalm by saying, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. And I think that's part of what he means by my cup is overflowing. You may, I don't know if you're looking at that this evening and saying, I don't quite get that about my life. Can I just tell you, all I'm going to do is to say to you, that's my life. I'm not saying everything everywhere is going perfect. I'm saying it seems like to me that goodness and mercy has followed me all the days of my life. And I owe every bit of it to the Lord. I owe all that he's done to him. If you look at the 100th Psalm, first 5 verses, he says, shout joyfully to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful singing. Know that the Lord himself is God. It is he who made us and not we ourselves. We are the people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and bless his name. For the Lord is good, and his loving kindness is everlasting, and his faithfulness to all generations. The Lord has been good to me, and the Lord has been good to many of you. And then we come to that final great statement. He said, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I understand that two different directions. One is he's saying, I'm so satisfied with my shepherd, I don't care about going my own way anymore. He's done me so well by teaching me what he's taught me, leading me in paths of righteousness, taking me in the direction. Even when I've wandered off, he's come and sought me and brought me back. I'm so thankful to have that shepherd that I'm staying with him forever. I'll dwell in his house from now on. I don't want to be in his flock. I don't want to be in anybody else's flock. I'm happy where I am. Well, I think the secondary thing we learn out of that is to stop and think that Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you. And that when he says forever, he doesn't mean for the rest of your life. He means forever. And that you and I can dwell with the Lord and in his house forever. Somebody presented this analogy, and I liked it. I don't know that it represents exactly everything David was trying to say, but they pictured the shepherd, and he's leading us, and he's taking us through our own valley of the shadow of death. And we're going through this valley called death, and it's dark, and it's kind of frightening. But I'm not going to be afraid because it says, thou art with me. And I know I've got you with me, Lord, and I know you're going to stand by me. So we're walking this path together. But there's no such thing as an eternal valley. Sooner or later you get out of the valley and you get back in the sunshine. And imagine a shepherd that took you through the valley, and it's been pretty hard, rocky, dangerous a little bit. He watched out for you. And you're in that valley of the shadow of death, and then finally the light breaks. The valley's over. I'm walking into the most beautiful green pasture you've ever seen, with the water flowing nearby in a gentle way. And now I'm in that beautiful place that he's prepared for me. Now, I think he does a lot for us in this life, but he says, I'm doing a lot for you eternally too. I'm getting a lot ready for you up there. So how wonderful it'll be to cross the valley of the shadow of death and emerge to be in the house of the Lord forever. No more to be parted, no more to stray. That's a pretty good thought if you stop to think about it. To be in the house of the Lord forever. That's what we all are hoping for. To dwell there eternally with him. Thank you for your attention. We're going to sing a song of invitation.